In August of 2011, I was in a meeting with some colleagues not far from here, watching a video presentation, when the image on the screen began to shake a little bit. I looked around at everyone else in the room to make sure I wasn't just imagining it, but they were looking around too, and were just as confused as I was. Moments later, we all felt the floor begin to shake and shudder. Not very much, but enough to get our attention. And after a few more seconds of dumbfounded silence, someone finally said, "I think this is an earthquake." Couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but at about the 15-second mark, we were all scrambling to get outside as fast as we could, where we all stood around wondering what in the world just happened. Could that really have been an earthquake? Well, it really was an earthquake. And as it turns out, the entire city of Philadelphia had the same experience. Do you all remember that, 2011? It wasn't a very big quake at all. But all over Center City, folks streamed out of the high-rise buildings in utter disbelief. Sky Chopper 6 hovered overhead to cover the scene. Fire trucks and emergency personnel were dispatched to make sure everyone was okay and to assess the damage. And as far as I know, the only damage found was one shattered pane of glass in the Independence Blue Cross building at 17th and Market. But that's what happens during an earthquake on the East Coast. Those things just don't happen around here. Hurricanes, we understand. Snowstorms and nor'easters, we get. But earthquakes? We know just enough about earthquakes to be terrified at the least little tremor. I was talking to a friend earlier this week who used to live on the West Coast and has been through many earthquakes. And she said there's just nothing quite like it. No matter how frequently they happen, no matter how accustomed to them that you think you are, you never really get used to them. Everything around you shakes. Things that aren't supposed to move ever move. The floor, the walls, the ceiling, furniture dances across the floor, pictures fall. Glass breaks, you lose your balance, you're completely disoriented, and you have no idea how long it's going to last, how bad it's going to get, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do to escape it. You are utterly helpless and completely at its mercy. I say all of that because in Matthew's telling of Jesus' resurrection, there's an earthquake. Did you catch that? As the women arrive at the tomb, an angel of the Lord appears, the earth quakes, and the stone that sealed the tomb is rolled away. Jesus' resurrection is literally a seismic event. And it has the same terrifying effect on the soldiers who are guarding the tomb as it has on most of us. Matthew says the guards shook and became like dead men. It's an incredible cinematic event that is only recorded by Matthew. And Matthew seems fascinated by earthquakes. If you go back a few verses earlier to Jesus' crucifixion, you read that the earth shook and the rocks split at the moment of Jesus' death. Matthew is the only one who records that earthquake as well. In fact, Matthew is so interested in earthquakes that earlier, when he describes Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, he doesn't call it a storm. like the other Gospels. He actually uses the term seismos, Greek for earthquake. So in Matthew's telling, Jesus literally calmed the earthquake on the sea, as if the storm were these moving mountains on the water. So what is it with Matthew and earthquakes? Well, Matthew is working really hard in his gospel to make all of the connections to the Old Testament that he can. And one of the hallmarks of God's presence in the Old Testament is earthquakes. When God descends upon Mount Sinai to meet with the people of Israel, the mountain shakes, and the Israelites along with it. Centuries later, when the prophet Elijah fled to that same mountain in despair, in desperate need of God's encouragement and help, God's presence was heralded first by a rock-splitting wind, then an earthquake, before appearing as fire and finally a whisper. In other words, when God shows up as Israel's deliverer, it is always an earth-shaking event. It's wonderful. It's glorious. But it's also disorienting, even terrifying. So in the Old Testament, when God's people are oppressed and suffering, and he promises to come and rescue them, the prophets tell them that they'll know God is taking action when the earthquake hits. They proclaim that on the day of the Lord, the earth will shake, the rocks will split, and God's people will be rescued. God's people will be given new life. Well, isn't that exactly what happens at both Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection from the grave? Again, when Jesus dies on the cross, the earth quakes and the rocks split. The shaking even tears the curtain veil in the temple in half from top to bottom. When the women arrive at the tomb, it happens again. The earth shakes as an angel appears and explains that the tomb is empty. Jesus is not there. He's been raised from the dead. The earthquake is God's way of saying, I'm here. God's way of saying, I am rescuing you. I am going to set everything right. God's way of saying, get ready for the new life that I have for you. But why does it have to be so scary? Why an earthquake? Because sometimes for God to do the new thing, old things have to be shaken to the ground. And isn't this how God shows up in our own lives? You were never going to leave that old job, the one that you knew was a dead end, the one that underutilized your gifts until it all fell apart. Your job was eliminated, your department closed, or the job finally broke you. Your career was shaken to the ground, and you were shaken. Only then did God set you on a new career path. Or that relationship with your friend or your spouse or that family member, you know the one. It was never going to change, was it? You'd already stopped hoping for more. You'd resigned yourself to frustration and unhappiness. And then God shook the ground and it just fell apart. Maybe you had the blow up that finally changed it all. or maybe it finally broke you. But what felt like the end was God's new beginning, new life for your relationship. And that's just how it goes. Sometimes to lay hold of the new thing that God has for us, we have to be willing to let it all go, to risk losing it all. So God shows up and the earth quakes until it all falls to the ground. And it happens on a grand scale too, right? The God who has rocked your world intends to rock the entire world. He means to rock all of the established systems we put in place from top to bottom. All the ways that we maintain the status quo through inequality and racism and the politics of raw power, and just shake them to the ground to make room for his kingdom. The veil that separates his holiness from our way of life is being torn from top to bottom. It's all shaking. Can you feel the shaking? I know it's always scary. Even when we know the system isn't working, it's the only system we know, and when it shakes, we're frightened. But that's how God brings salvation. That's how Jesus' life and the power of his resurrection show up in our lives and the world. He shakes things up. But we need to notice one more thing. By the time the women arrived at the tomb that morning and the earth shook, Jesus had already been raised from the dead. They weren't there to witness the resurrection itself. No one was. And that was God's idea. The earthquake signaled that the resurrection had already happened, that Jesus was already on the move. They didn't need to actually see the resurrection happen to be changed. And neither do you. They just needed to know that Jesus had been raised and was on the move, and to be ready to encounter the resurrected Christ when he shows up. The shaking meant that the resurrected Christ had already been turned loose on the world, and we all have to catch up. So this morning, know that when the earth starts to move under your feet and you are disoriented, know that when everything is shaking, and even the things that would normally steady you with you are shaking too, know that the tomb is empty. Jesus is alive. He's already on the move. I'm telling you, no matter what you are suffering, no matter your struggles, however you are oppressed, Jesus intends to split the rocks and to roll away the stone. If you are united to him, you will be raised with him to new life now and in the age to come. It's happening. Get ready. Jesus shook the world that Easter morning, and he is shaking it still. Shaking is the old things passing away, because God is determined to give us new lives and a new world. May God grant us then the grace to not just feel the fear, but the joy of that first Easter morning, even as he shakes the world. Amen.